As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a very special guest tonight, Dr. Arthur T. Bradley. He's a senior engineer at NASA. He's an Army veteran, martial arts expert, author of multiple books on preparedness, and also, most recently, author of the Survivalist series available on Amazon. Dr. Bradley is here with us today to talk about a very particular type of threat to anyone who lives in an industrialized country. Dr. Bradley, thank you for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Sure, thank you for having me.
You've written recently about the reality, the risks, and the types of threat that come from an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. And it's a bit ironic that bringing this up in the preparedness community, because so often the most characteristic caricature that's sometimes portrayed of people who are consider themselves preppers is they talk about, well, you have your tinfoil hats ready, and people talk about protecting yourself in that way. But what we'd like to find out more from you tonight is to really take a scientific and engineering look at what is the real credible threat of an EMP, and what would the impact be of that, what would likely sources be of that, and how can people take simple, direct action to help reduce the risk of impact of that to their lives and their family. So, first of all, if you could help our listeners know who you are and why you're specifically qualified to talk about this subject.
Sure, yeah, so that's actually a very good question. If you search the web, just sort of EMP and how to protect against an EMP, you'll find lots of sort of advice, and some of it agrees and some of it disagrees. So I really recommend people, ask the questions of who is it that's telling me this, and are they really the right person to be listening to? So each listener can decide on their own whether I'm that person or not, but they should at least ask that question. So I think it's where you should always start. So a little bit about me. I think you mentioned I work at NASA during the day, which all that means is that I'm a technical engineering sort of guy. I have a PhD in electrical engineering from Auburn University. I'm a certified EMI EMC engineer, and of all of my credentials, that's probably the one that's most relevant to this topic, and that really just means that somebody has professionally worked in the field of electromagnetic interference and compatibility. And there's not that many of those folks out there, but it means that they sort of their day job is working with electromagnetic stuff. So that's something I can at least tout. I'm also a licensed professional engineer, and I've worked for, the last 15 years or so, helping NASA through various problems, many of them related to EMI, EMC. So just from a technical standpoint, I have a pretty good background. I'm not going to say I'm the leading expert in the world on electrical engineering, but I have a pretty good background in the field, and so I can talk about some of the important aspects of an EMP that maybe somebody who didn't have engineering background couldn't really talk to.
Well, let's start with that. What is an EMP?
Right. So an EMP, as you said, is just an electromagnetic pulse, and really all that is it's a very short duration in time pulse of electromagnetic energy, and so it can be caused by many different things. I mean, we probably all know when you have a storm go by, if you're watching television or something, and lightning strikes nearby, you'll get a little zap on the television, a little disturbance, and that's really due to the electromagnetic pulse that the lightning puts out. It's a very high current event that happens, and it sort of puts out this broadband pulse, and anything, electronics-wise can pick that up and somehow transmit it in ways you can see it. So lightning is certainly an electromagnetic pulse. The sun also emits things called coronal mass ejections and solar flares, which can cause electromagnetic pulse events at Earth as well. And then the one that we're talking about mostly is high-altitude nuclear-generated electromagnetic pulse. And that's really when you take a nuclear or atomic weapon and you detonate it in the atmosphere. You can detonate a relatively low atmosphere or a higher atmosphere if you want to get a broader area of impact. And there's some unusual phenomena that occur in the atmosphere when you do that, but you basically generate gamma rays, and the gamma rays end up perturbating the Earth's electromagnetic field, if you will. That's felt down at the surface of the Earth in many different ways, and we can talk about why that is. But that's really when people are talking about EMP, they're really talking about those nuclear-generated EMP events that happen.
And that's a very different kind than the kind that would just be caused by natural occurrences. So what kind of countries are capable of initiating that type of an attack?
Well, any country that has two things really could do an EMP attack. They have to have some type of missile that can get up high enough, and they have to have a nuclear warhead that they can detonate. And so you can go down the list of, sort of nuclear-armed countries in the world. But the two, I think, that are probably the biggest threat, maybe you can add a third one in, but the two that are certainly the biggest threat for the United States would be China and Russia. And Russia has made numerous threats throughout the years. They're very familiar with, they did EMP testing back in the 70s, just like we did. And they're very, very familiar with the possible effects, and they've made very open comments about, not if we detonated an EMP over your country, you wouldn't do this, And so they've been pretty overt about it over the years. China hasn't been that way. They sort of operate in a different way, but they certainly possess the ability to do it. And the third one that might be a candidate, that we sort of consider on our unfriendlies list would be North Korea. And North Korea, if we follow the news, they're always working on their rocket technologies so that, they're trying to get something that can reach continental United States. And if they were, even today, without that full ability, if they were to take, maybe a trawler into the Gulf of Mexico and launch a missile up into the atmosphere and detonate it over maybe the eastern seaboard or something, they could really fundamentally change life in the United States for many years to come. Estimates of even a single EMP over the continental United States, especially on the eastern seaboard, could be like $1 trillion or more in economic effects on the country. So you can imagine what that would do from a single launch of a single missile. So, it's a real threat. I think there are others that could do it as well, but I think those are probably the most likely candidates.
That kind of extensive damage, what kind of damage specifically would an EMP cause?
Yeah, so that's where a lot of the misinformation sort of gets out there. Is there's been a lot of fiction written on EMPs. It's good fiction. It's good stories. I enjoy reading them like everybody. But so there's some things are known and some things are not known. And sort of the best data we have is from something called the EMP Commission report. And basically, the government got worried and put together a big panel of experts, and they sort of studied this question, what would be damaged? And so the data that I sort of spout and typically tell people is from sort of that report and what I've pulled from it. And so we can kind of go down the laundry list, but the biggest effect, without a doubt, would be to the nation's electrical grid. So it just ends up that these long transmission lines really take energy in very well. They act like these sort of nice antennas, and they pick up that electromagnetic energy. And they can, in turn, have so much current flowing in them that they can damage these very large transformers that are used to condition this power on this grid. And those transformers are very expensive and very hard to build, and they could take many months, if you took enough of them out, many months to be replaced. And so that's sort of the biggest threat. If you think about, what happens if 70% of the continental United States was out of power and would be without power, let's say for 6 months, it's unlike any event we would have ever seen. And so that's sort of the big threat, taking out electricity, because it's sort of the lifeblood of everything else, right? All of the other infrastructures depend on it, and we can talk about that to some extent. But so the electrical grid is one. The other one that is specific to a nuclear EMP, now not to a solar EMP, but a nuclear EMP is a very broadband event with really fast rise time on its very first pulse. And so that can actually couple into very small electronics, just your cell phone or your laptop computer or your automobile or whatever. So it can couple enough energy into those to damage modern solid-state electronics. So computers could go, certainly control systems like for water plants and anything you can kind of telecommunications and those kind of things, air traffic control systems, all of those things are susceptible. So you can imagine, now not everything would be damaged, but let's just say a percentage of all of these items were damaged. The amount of chaos that it would cause and the disruption it would cause would really be even hard to imagine. But so the nuclear EMP possesses that unique ability to really reach down and touch individual devices all throughout people's houses and everything else. The one I want to touch on just a little bit that gets sort of misreported is about automobiles, and that's because many times in fiction, it makes great fiction if you just sort of make all of the cars in the world stop working. I mean, then everybody's got to sort of hike everywhere, and it's interesting. In reality, it doesn't seem the data supports that. It sort of goes like this. The cars that are operating, that you're driving, maybe about 70% of those would stall out or would have some kind of anomaly on them. So maybe the dashboards would go flickery. Even if they kept running, you would see some kind of electrical anomaly. Your radio would go spastic or something. Of those, some percentage of them, let's say a third of those that started having weird anomalies, would just stall on the road. And so you would essentially lose power to your vehicle. So you can imagine that's maybe 1 out of every 6 cars on the road all of a sudden just sort of stalls. Imagine what that would be like, right? And then of those, maybe 1 out of every 3 of those would be permanently damaged. So maybe about 5% of all cars and trucks that were running in the United States that was in the area of this effect would immediately be damaged and not be able to be restarted. And that might be on the order, well, you can figure 300 million vehicles at any time, and maybe half of those are running. So you might be talking about 7 million cars in the blink of an eye that all of a sudden didn't run, and many more than that started having problems. So while it's not as bad as maybe the fictional stories like to sort of portray, it would still be incredibly bad, and there would be accidents everywhere and stalled cars everywhere, and it would be a pretty enormous feat to try and overcome just that one thing by itself. So maybe that gives you a little feel of kind of the kinds of damage that could occur.
Well, when you mentioned cars that were in the immediate area that was being affected, how widespread could the area of effect be in one of these events?
Yeah, so it's really a line-of-sight event. A lot of RF stuff is sort of based on line-of-sight. And
RF is radio frequency.
Yeah, it's RF radio frequency. And so if you launch, let's say, a missile up into the atmosphere, anything above about 25 miles, so there's sort of a region from 25 miles to about 200 miles where you would ideally like to detonate this missile. And that's because you're above what's called a source region, and that source region helps to sort of magnify the effect. So you want to put it up above about 20 miles, 25 miles, and the higher the better. If you can get it up close to a couple hundred miles, you can essentially see almost all of the continental United States from that one vantage point. And so in theory and in simulations, a single nuclear warhead, even a very modest one, detonated at that kind of altitude, a couple hundred miles, could take out about 70 to 80% of the continental United States. So imagine if you really choreograted it, a Russia attack wouldn't be one missile, it might be 10 missiles, and they would be spread accordingly to ensure overlapping coverage. So it wouldn't take much to take out a vast, swath of the United States in terms of this kind of damage.
In the face of that, how can people conceivably protect any of their personal electronics or their cars?
Yeah, so cars are sort of everybody wants, well, what do I do? I've read all kinds of things from dragging a chain behind your bumper to, various things. And the truth of it is on automobiles, there's really not much you can do. If your vehicle's not running, if an event were to happen and your vehicle was in the garage, it would almost certainly survive. If you were on the road, you were unfortunate to be, driving to work or driving on the interstate, you'd have a pretty good shot of your vehicle surviving, but you'd also have a very good shot that something would happen. You would lose power for a brief period of time, but at least it would probably restart. But there's not much you can do to really protect it without having an engineering degree and really spending the time on, how to reduce noise in electronic systems. And it just wouldn't be worth the time and energy. You sort of are at the luck of the dice in terms of your vehicle. So all of the hype that people say about, you do this or you do that and you make your car less likely to be affected. I don't really see any data to support that. I will say that you could cover your car, for example, if it was stored. I did some testing for the book Disaster Preparedness for EMP Attacks, and where I built a homemade car cover, a conductive car cover, and I covered up my car and I did RF testing to see how much it protected it, and it did a pretty good job. It took about 95% of the energy that was incident on the car and shielded it from the inside. So you could develop something special like that if you were really, really wanted to protect it. But by and large, you're sort of at the mercy of where you are and what's going on, in terms of vehicles. Now, in terms of personal electronics, there is quite a bit more you can do. Most people have probably heard of Faraday cages, but just in case you haven't, it's basically just an enclosure, a full 360-degree enclosure. So, bottom, top, all the sides. It's a metal box of any shape. And, ideally, it's a solid surface. In a perfect world, it would be like a solid sphere of aluminum or something like that. And you put your stuff on the inside and close it up. Now, it could be like a box that you've wrapped in aluminum foil. It could be many different ways. Or galvanized steel garbage cans are used frequently, where you just sort of put your stuff inside the garbage can and put the lid on and tape the seam around the outside. And all those things work pretty well. In the book, I do tests of lots of things that people had suggested, from ammo cans to microwave ovens to garbage cans. And all of them, if you take the right precautions to tape up the seams with conductive tape, they do a pretty good job. And the truth is, most of them would very likely allow small-scale electronics to survive if they were placed inside of them. So, there's a lot of free people can search the web and sort of find what they think works for them. The ones I like in particular, I like just aluminum wrapping a box with a lid on it, which is a nice simple Faraday cage. And I have some pictures on YouTube. My username is Disaster Prepper. You can just search that and you can find videos of me building the little boxes. I like those because they're very simple. And I also like the anti-static bags, or some people call them EMP bags. And they're basically bags meant for putting electronic boards in them to keep them from being damaged by static electricity. And I've tested numerous kinds of those. And the very best kind is a type called Dry Shield. It's just a particular name of the bags. I sell them on my website at disasterprepare.com, but they have them many places on the web. You can look for them. But those are great because you just stick your stuff in the bag, fold them over, put a strip of tape across the top, and you're done. So it's a nice, convenient way to do that.
You mentioned that you did some testing. How do you go about testing the effectiveness of a Faraday cage or a bag?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's probably the question I get asked the most is, I built up a Faraday cage. Now, how do I tell if it's any good? And unfortunately, there's not a really simple way for someone without test equipment to do that. So you basically have to have a few pieces of equipment. One of them is a signal generator, which lets you sort of generate the frequencies of interest. The other one is an amplifier, which amplifies the signal so that it's large enough so you can transmit it. And then the third thing you need is an antenna. And so all of that spells a lot of money, tens of thousands of dollars. And so if you have that test equipment already handy, you can do shielding effectiveness tests, in a matter of hours. It's not a big deal, and I've done a lot of those tests. But if you don't, it's much harder. Let's say you built up your trash can, and you're like, yeah, but now how do I know if it's any good? And one thing people will do is they'll try these two-way radios. They'll put one of the two-way radios inside the can and then try and talk, put the lid on. They'll try and talk inside the other two-way radio. And unfortunately, they always get the signal through whatever they've built. It always transmits through it, and they think, my can is no good. But in reality, that test is not a very good test. It's very, very difficult to block a two-way radio signal, as you can imagine, because they're meant to pick up very faint signals. So the only way I have found that people can really check a Faraday cage, and it's not a great way, but it's a way, is you can, let's say you want to check out a static bag, and you're like, okay, I put my two-way radio in here, and I turned it on, and I've got my other one, and I seal up the bag. Now, if I try and talk to the radio, it will still work. It will still get through the bag. But if you do 3 layers of your Faraday cage, so you put a bag inside of a bag inside of a bag, let's say, if those are all very good quality Faraday cages, that is about the right amount to block a two-way radio. It takes about 3 layers. So it's not a great way because, who wants to build 3 layers of anything, but it does give you a way, especially if you were just checking anti-static bags, a pretty easy way of checking out your anti-static bags. If you bought cheapo ones and you put 3 of them together, they still won't block the radio. 4 of them probably wouldn't block the radios even. So the shorter answer is it's hard to test them without the right test equipment. But if you have a good Faraday cage, it takes about 3 layers to block a two-way radio.
I'm thinking back to the movie Enemy of the State with Gene Hackman and Will Smith that came out about 5 or 7 years ago. And in that, the Gene Hackman character is ex-CIA, I think, and he's built this in this warehouse, basically an entire laboratory for himself. He calls it the bug jar, and he lives inside there, and the whole thing is made out of like copper mesh, but it's full of holes. It's not solid like what you're describing. So that's a follow-up question is, can your Faraday cage have holes in it? And does it need to be grounded?
Yeah, 2 great questions. So, It ends up that what really matters most about a Faraday, so the short answer is yes, your Faraday cage can have holes. In fact, it can have lots of holes. You can build a great Faraday cage out of, of fine mesh, like you can think of like a screen door. Small holes are fine. It ends up that as long as the holes are tiny with respect to the wavelengths of the incident wave, then that essentially acts like a solid surface anyway. So what really matters most is that you don't have any long seams. All right, so if you have your choice between a 1-inch diameter hole in the middle of your Faraday cage or a very thin 1-inch seam, you would take the hole every time, although that seems so counterintuitive. But it ends up that these narrow seams, these slots, they act as something called a slot antenna, and they let in this electromagnetic energy quite efficiently. And so there's an interesting experiment I do on YouTube where I take a galvanized garbage can and I just put the metal lid on it. It's nice and tight, and I put a spectrum analyzer inside of it so I can measure the signals, and then I measure them, and it ends up only dropping about what we call, and we measure in decibels, but it drops about 10 decibels of the signal, which is about 90% of the signal. The problem is that's not very good. You want to get like 50 dB or so. You want to drop about 99.7% of the signal, and so what I show is that if you just run a seam around the outside of that can where the lid goes on top of the can, if you run a strip of like copper tape or aluminum tape, you drop from 10 dB to maybe about 45 dB with just that single strip of tape. And so it really highlights the importance of those long, narrow seams and how they can let in the energy. So that's critically important. So yes, you can have small holes, but don't have any long seams that haven't been taped up.
And what about grounded?
Yeah, the grounding question, I think, is probably due more to misunderstanding. So we ground things all the time, especially we earth ground them, and oftentimes that's for lightning protection. So the idea is, lightning strikes nearby or lightning strikes a rod, and you want to shunt that energy away to earth as quick as you can before it has a way to find its way through your equipment. And so grounding is really useful in that way. And there's other reasons for grounding too, but that's sort of most relevant. Now, with an EMP, the energy is not that kind of, find its way through every part, I'm going to shun it away. It sort of sets up a field, a high-intensity electric field across devices. And it ends up that if you have a really good Faraday cage, 360 degrees, like a box or something that you've made up, grounding it won't have any benefit whatsoever. And so going to all that trouble, I've seen people, attach ground leads, and then they attach an earth ground and drive a rod into the earth. If anything, it oftentimes causes their Faraday cage to not perform quite as well. So I don't recommend grounding a Faraday cage. It's not necessary. All the experiments we do with things stuck in Faraday cages are never. The Faraday cages are freestanding. They're just sitting on tables, and they do a great job of blocking field. So I don't see any reason whatsoever to do that.
Speaking of putting things inside a Faraday cage, what sort of items would you recommend people consider putting in a Faraday cage if they want to protect themselves?
Sure. So, we can talk about broader preparedness in general. So a Faraday cage is just like, one little aspect of a very specific threat of this nuclear EMP. Just so I don't forget to say, if you have a solar generated event that causes an EMP, you don't need a Faraday cage because that energy does not couple into small electronics. Okay, so this is only for nuclear generated EMPs. But the kind of things people often talk about storing in it are any kind of like electronic medical devices, like a backup system for if you had glucose meters or whatever things that, you might use for health monitoring that would be important. You can certainly have ham radios or any kind of two-way radio systems that might, so you can imagine if everything sort of went to hell in a handbasket and you couldn't communicate, any way of communicating would be useful. Shortwave radios are also nice. You could tune in if there's some emergency broadcast. You could tune into those. And people have gone down the list. Everything from disposable cell phones, which, you have to question, well, would there be any self-service? And likely there would not be. But nevertheless, anything that's sort of small-scale, oftentimes used for communication. Other people have suggested things like red dot sights, for example, for your rifle. They don't want understandably don't want those to be damaged, so maybe store those away. Things that you don't normally use on a day-to-day basis that you think in the times of a real emergency, might be beneficial. And every person's sort of a little bit unique in that way of what they use and what's important to them. But that's kind of the idea of it.
how do we really prepare for something like this? Because the effects are broader than just that first moment. And you mentioned before the incidental effects could be broad and extensive across the economy, across the industrial and technology infrastructure. So how do you go about preparing for a risk like this?
Right. So this is one of those high impact, low frequency events, right? And there are others that super volcano explosion or an asteroid hitting the Earth or other. I mean, things that really fundamentally disrupt life, and for some period of time. It's not like in a week everything would be back to normal. And so those kind of preparations, I mean, it's not something you can do in a day or a week. You really have to sort of take a broad look at, how do I make myself where I can sort of sustain myself if I lost all of the support networks. And you can start wherever everybody can start at different places. And, I walk through a lot of this in the Handbook to Practical Disaster Preparedness. I sort of walk through the different needs and, starting maybe with food is the first thing people think about. Okay, yeah, I should stockpile some food. That makes sense. And how much you stockpile is sort of up to the individual. I always tell people for just sort of normal emergencies, normal disasters that we might face, you should store at least 30 days of food in your house, which that was probably the thing I take most criticism for is, you said you should only store 30 days of food, but, things could last much longer. And I'm not saying only store 30 days. I'm just saying that's usually enough for most events that you will have in your life. 30 days is enough to right the ship. Now, an EMP, that's not a normal disaster. That's a very different thing. And so it's certainly, if somebody really wanted to be prepared, maybe they would store 6 months of food or a year's worth of food. But if you've never stored food before, start slow, learn what to store, how to store it, or you can end up wasting a lot of money to spoilage and other problems. So food is one. Again, the types of food you can store, you can learn that as you go. Water is the one that a lot of people forget. You can't store a year's worth of water. Most people can't anyway, because it's just too heavy and too much volume. But I always say that for normal emergencies, every person should store enough for about 2 gallons of water per person per day for at least 2 weeks. So worst comes to worst and you have no water service, you've got 2 weeks of water supply. If you're rationing it, 2 gallons of water is not a lot of water. A gallon for drinking, a gallon for cleaning yourself up each day. So sort of just like a ballpark of about 28 gallons of water per person. Again, that's for a normal kind of emergency, right? That's like, all right, I give myself a little buffer to gather supplies, Again, an EMP is not a normal emergency. So what you have to do for water, typically since you can't store it, is you have to identify some alternate sources. And you have to have ways of purifying and cleaning that water, making it safe to drink. So all of us, luckily, we live on a planet where most of us have water in various forms from rivers and lakes, and you can go on down the road and find different things. And so you have to figure out what's close to you, how you could retrieve that water, how you could purify that water, and sort of have a sustainable plan where you have enough water, to sort of maintain hygiene and also keep yourself hydrated. So food and water is sort of where it all starts. And then there's a whole list. I think I list 14 different needs that sort of people have to hit. If you rely on any kind of electricity for anything, you have to have some kind of little backup system for that. Could be solar powered. People say, I have my generator, and that's fine for sort of short-term emergencies. If you've ever had a generator, you know what I mean. They drink fuel like it's crazy. They go through it very quickly. You typically can only store about 25 gallons legally in the United States, or you'll violate the fire code. So, you might only be able to run your generator for a few days. So generator is generally not a long-term kind of solution just because of the fuel problem. So you typically have to go with, solar or wind or something that's sort of renewable, that you can keep charging up your batteries and then using your batteries to run something, and that kind of thing. So one thing I do recommend people, if you don't have a generator system that you know and trust and really rely on, is to maybe look at getting an inverter, which is basically just a way to take the power from a battery and turn it into AC power that you can plug your lights into or plug your washing machine into or whatever, that kind of thing. So an inverter, people can do some homework on different size inverters and what's important about them, but a battery system, an inverter, and then something to charge the batteries. That's sort of the 3 elements sort of a renewable system. Some way of charging the batteries, use the batteries to run the inverter, plug into the inverter, and run your equipment. So electricity is another one of them, and you can go on down the list: personal protection and firearms, and on and on and on. But it's a long-term, really dedicated person who can focus on sort of surviving these high-impact, low-frequency events, because most people will be grossly unprepared for them. And so, again, you start small, you make it where you can survive for a couple of weeks, if anything, then you build that up to a month, and then you figure out, how do I go from 1 month to 6 months? What does it take? And it's sort of a life change to be able to do that.
And if people want to find out more about your work, where can they go for more information?
Well, they can go to my website is disasterpreparer.com. There's some free information on there. I put out like some kits for your cars that people might keep things in their cars, or just some general preparedness information is on there as well. And they can also certainly search the web. I have various videos and on Amazon, various books for sale about general preparedness as well as EMP attacks. So they could find me pretty easily. Arthur Bradley. If you search Arthur Bradley, you can usually find something.
I can personally vouch for the usefulness of your book, the Disaster Preparedness Handbook. My son gave it to me as a gift, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly. It's when I first started this channel, it's like something that I had imagined I might be able to create, but realized quickly as I started, I didn't have the background information. I had some specific knowledge in very limited areas. I had intuition in a lot of other areas, but mostly what I became aware of was that I mostly had ignorance in a lot of areas. So I found that book of yours, the Disaster Preparedness Handbook, particularly helpful because of its breadth. It just gives a really thorough overview of many different aspects of what types of emergencies do occur, are likely to occur, how extensive they can be, and what goes through, like you said, a lot of different life necessity aspects and what considerations you might want to do to prepare for those, in some areas that I certainly hadn't thought of. So really appreciate the depth of breadth of thought that you've put into this, and the generosity that you've brought to sharing your insights with people all over through your work. So if anybody wants to get in contact with you, is there any way that they should?
Sure, they can go to the website, disasterpreparer.com, and then at the bottom there's a contact me link. You can just click that and it sends me email.
Very good. Dr. Arthur Bradley, author of the Disaster Preparedness Handbook and several other books, including his recent fiction series, the Survivalist series, including your most recent episode of that just came out. What was the most recent title?
Yeah, the most recent one just came out 2 days ago. It's called Dark Days.
So check that out on Amazon, folks, and we look forward, hopefully, that Dr. Bradley will be willing to come back and address some of these other specific topics. Today we spent most of our time talking about EMP, but if we could talk with you about some maybe even higher frequency risks that people should be aware of or prepared for, we'd like to have you back again.
Sure, that sounds great.
Excellent, thank you.